A nurse was fired for praying with a patient, until the patient's family revealed who she really was. She barely whispered the words, hands gently folded over the pale, trembling hand of a woman who had only hours left. The black nurse leaned closer, her voice steady but warm. "Lord, if you're listening, just bring her peace." And then, the door slammed open. Point two administrators stood there, arms crossed, faces unreadable. One of them, a younger white woman with a badge that read Director of Patient Services, stepped forward. "Miss Celeste," she said curtly, "please come with us. Now." The prayer wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It wasn't even directed at anyone in the room. But someone had filed a complaint, said it was unsolicited spiritual contact, that it made them deeply uncomfortable. Celeste stood up slowly, unsure if this was real. She had only prayed because the patient, barely lucid, had grabbed her wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let me go alone." But no one asked her about that. No one asked the patient's family either. Instead, by the end of the shift, Nurse Celeste Johnson was escorted out of the hospital by security. No golonbis, no due process, no final moment with the woman who'd just passed away less than an hour later. The hallway felt endless as she walked out of the only place she had worked in for 17 years. This is the story of how that single moment, a silent prayer between two women, triggered a chain of events no one saw coming. Not the hospital, not the city, not even Celeste herself. And by the end of it all, the world would come to see who she really was. Welcome to Cracks of Light, a channel dedicated to sharing the stories that slip through the noise, the quiet acts of faith, dignity, and redemption that prove humanity still shines in the darkest corners. If stories like this move you, we invite you to subscribe and join us. Your support keeps this light alive. Now let's go back, before the prayer, before the fallout, and meet the woman behind that trembling voice. The one they fired. The one they didn't know. Her name was Celeste Johnson, but a woman of 62, with kind eyes and strong hands. She had been called many things. The quiet one, the nurse who remembers everyone's name, the lady with the lavender hand lotion. But no one ever called her weak, not even when her world collapsed. Twice. Celeste was the kind of nurse who brought an extra granola bar for the security guard who always skipped breakfast, who stayed 2 hours past her shift because she couldn't bear leaving a dementia patient alone before dinner, who kept a Ziploc of bandages in her purse for the unhoused man who waited outside the ER every Friday night. But all of that didn't matter the day she was escorted out of the hospital like a criminal. To the staff, she was gone. To HR, she was a liability. To the patient's family, she was a mystery. And to the few who knew her past, a very select few, she was someone far more than what they assumed. You see, before Celeste was a nurse, before she was even a mother, she was the daughter of someone with a name that echoed in halls far more powerful than that hospital. But she never told anyone. Because it wasn't about who raised her, it was about who she chose to be. And that choice would be tested again and again. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The building was quiet, old, and overlooked a community garden she volunteered to water every Sunday. Her clothes were always clean, her shoes polished. She never owed anyone a thing, and she paid everything in cash. But dignity, as Celeste would learn once again, doesn't protect you from prejudice. The day after she was fired, the headlines didn't care about context. One local blog labeled her, "Religious zealot fired after praying with terminal patient without consent." No one asked the patient's name. And no one mentioned the trembling grip on Celeste's hand, or the words whispered by the dying woman. Just the word, zealot, a word that buried 17 years of service like it meant nothing. And still Celeste didn't speak. Not to the press. Not on social media. She simply packed her nurse's shoes in a box, placed her hospital badge on top, and closed the lid. Some people would fight. She chose quiet. But that quiet was not weakness. That quiet was her armor. Because this wasn't the first time the world had tried to silence her. Celeste had lived through silence before. When her husband, a construction worker, fell 3 stories and died because the site manager skipped safety inspections. She raised 2 daughters with nothing but overtime shifts and prayer. She buried her youngest when leukemia came too fast too fierce and too soon, and still she prayed. She didn't preach. She didn't protest. She prayed. And it was that prayer's soft, unassuming, unplanned that got her fired. But it was also that prayer that would reveal everything. 2 days after the firing, a funeral was held. Small, quiet. Only family and 2 nurses came. Celeste sat in the last row, not in uniform, just in a simple black dress and scarf. No one noticed her, or so she thought, until the woman's son stood to read a letter left by his mother. A final note for the family, T began, voice trembling. To whoever finds this, I don't know if I'll be here tomorrow. But if I'm not, please know the last moment of my life was held in the hands of an angel. He paused. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. She just prayed with me. And in that moment, I wasn't afraid. I don't know her name, but if you do, tell her thank you. Tell her she reminded me of my mother. Silence fell. Celeste lowered her head, eyes burning. But what happened next would change everything. The man stepped down from the altar, walked slowly past the pews, and stopped in front of her. He didn't ask. He didn't doubt. He simply whispered, "You're her, aren't you?" And then he knelt in front of everyone, in front of the hospital administrator who had just walked in front of the board member who had co-signed her termination, at a black woman fired for a silent prayer. The grieving son recognizing the soul who helped his mother die in peace, and the world about to see her not as a fired nurse, but as a daughter of grace. She gently lifted him to his feet. The moment crystallized. This story wasn't over. IT was just beginning. She didn't sleep that night. The apartment was quiet, but her mind was loud. The kind of loud that pressed in her chest and rattled around the hollow parts of her ribs. Celeste sat at the kitchen table, a lukewarm cup of tea in her hands, watching the streetlight outside flicker. That image of the young man kneeling in front of her at the funeral wouldn't leave her. Not because it was dramatic or sudden or poetic, but because it was real. He saw her in a room full of people who had judged, labeled, dismissed her without a second thought. He saw her. And yet, by morning, the world returned to its cold rhythm. The hospital didn't call. No apology. No statement. No attempt to make it right. Her inbox remained empty, except for a rejection letter from a nearby assisted living center where she had applied for a part-time care assistant role. "We have decided to pursue other candidates," was all it said. Celeste didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. Not since the night she found out her daughter's cancer had spread to her lungs. That was the last time tears served a purpose. Everything after that was just quiet endurance. But the days that followed her firing seemed to pile insult on top of injury. At the grocery store, a neighbor she'd known for over a decade suddenly turned her cart around. At the post office, someone whispered too loudly behind her, asking, "Isn't that the nurse who got fired for pushing religion on dying people?" And at the church she'd attended for 23 years, someone had placed a note in her mailbox. "Sometimes silence is better than dangerous prayers." She read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in her Bible. Not because she believed it, but because she believed one day she'd forgive whoever wrote it. Celeste spent her mornings walking the long blocks around her apartment complex. It was the only time she felt like herself. No labels, no job title, no controversy, just her shoes on pavement and the feel of the wind on her face. The same path every day, past the old bus stop where she used to wait with her youngest daughter, Layla, past the bench where her late husband once surprised her with a sandwich on her lunch break, past the community center she used to volunteer at before the arthritis in her knees got too loud. People would glance, sometimes stare, but no one spoke to her. And she preferred it that way, because it wasn't about what they said. It was about what they didn't ask. No one asked how she was surviving without a paycheck. No one asked what it felt like to give nearly 2 decades to a hospital, only to be discarded over a whispered prayer. No one asked if she was okay, but she was, in a quiet, broken way that only some people understand. Because the truth was, Celeste had been surviving long before any of this. She survived raising 2 children on one income after her husband's scaffolding accident ended in a silent phone call and a closed casket. She survived holding Layla's hand while watching her chest rise and fall slower each day. knowing there were no more treatments left to try. She survived waking up one morning and realizing her purpose, her calling to care for others, would never pay her enough to own the home she cleaned every Sunday. Celeste never asked for more. She only ever asked for enough. Enough to stay kind. Enough to stay soft in a world that pushed her to be hard. That's why it hurt more when people treated her kindness like a threat, like something to fear, like something to punish. A week after the funeral, she tried to apply for a job at a private clinic. The receptionist looked at her resume, raised an eyebrow, and said, "We're just not sure you'd be a good cultural fit." Celeste nodded, took back her papers, and thanked the woman for her time. That night, she opened the box where she kept Layla's things. The tiny ballet shoes, a drawing of a rainbow, a paper star that read, "My mom is the best nurse." She held it to her chest and whispered, "I'm trying, baby. I'm still trying." And she was. Every day, she tried. Even when the world shut every door in her face. Even when the neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. Even when the fridge held more empty space than food. Even when she walked to the church food pantry in a coat too thin for the weather and waited in line behind people who used to call her Nurse Celeste with a smile. And through it all, she never stopped helping. One afternoon, she saw a young mother struggling with 2 toddlers and a heavy bag of groceries. Celeste stepped in without a word and carried the bags to her car. The woman didn't recognize her. She didn't know the story. She just said thank you and drove away. Another time, at the pharmacy, an elderly man dropped his wallet. People stepped around it. She bent, picked it up, and returned it. He didn't thank her. He just grabbed it and walked off. Celeste didn't mind. Kindness was never about applause. It was about remembering who you are, even when the world forgets. But someone had noticed. A man in a gray sedan parked across the street. He had been watching from a distance. Not in a menacing way. Not like someone prying, but like someone searching for a confirmation. He held a folder on his lap. Inside, photos, newspaper clippings, a resume, a letter written in cursive on yellow paper. Her handwriting, the same one from the card she had left on the patient's bedside table that day, tucked under a vase of wilting flowers. He read the letter again for the 5th time, not because he didn't understand it, but because he couldn't believe the world had let someone like her go so easily. The woman they fired was not just a nurse. She was a lighthouse, and someone had noticed. But Celeste didn't know that yet. She just kept walking, past the familiar blocks, past the whispers, past the fear. She didn't know the folder was already on a desk that mattered, that her kindness had been recorded, that someone, somewhere, was preparing to open a door she hadn't even dared to knock on. She didn't expect a miracle, but life, it seemed, was quietly preparing one. All she had to do was keep walking. The rain started before dawn. Not a storm, not the kind that howls and shatters. It was the quiet kind. The kind that slipped through window cracks and onto tired wooden floors. The kind that made the world feel even lonelier than usual. Celeste sat by the window with a blanket over her shoulders and a cold piece of toast untouched on the plate beside her. Across the street, the man in the gray sedan was gone. She hadn't noticed him, not really. Just a passing shape in the background of her mornings. And anyway, she had bigger things on her mind. That morning, she opened the letter from the city. It was official. Her license to practice nursing was under investigation. Not suspended, not revoked yet, but flagged. A formal complaint had been escalated. She would be required to attend a disciplinary hearing in 30 days. Her hands trembled as she read the lines over and over, as if the words would change. They didn't. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Layla's photo. No tears came, but something inside her cracked a little deeper. That evening, she went to the church. Not to pray, not even to sit in a pew, just to be inside somewhere warm and silent. The lights were dim. The janitor barely looked up as she passed. Celeste found a spot in the back corner and sat there for almost an hour, staring at the stained glass window of a woman holding a lamb. The same window she had stared at after her husband's funeral. The same one after Layla's diagnosis. It didn't speak to her. It never did. But it listened. And sometimes that was enough. She left before anyone could speak to her. On her way out, she passed two women by the door. One of them whispered, "That's her, the one who forced prayers on that patient." The other clutched her purse tighter. Celeste didn't stop, didn't turn, just walked, her shoes soaked through by the time she got home. In her building's hallway, she found a flyer taped to her door. Community watch reminder. Please report any suspicious activity, especially from those recently in the news. No name, but she knew. That night, she didn't sleep. Again, she sat on the edge of her bed, rereading the letter from the patient's son, the one he had handed her at the funeral after the service ended. She hadn't shown it to anyone. It was private, sacred. "Miss Celeste," it began, "my mother told me something before she passed. She said there are some people whose kindness feels like home. I believe you are one of those people." He had signed it simply, Aaron. It wasn't much, but it was everything. And still, it couldn't fix what came next. 2 days later, she received a notice from her landlord. Her rent was overdue. Not by much, just enough. A red stamp at the bottom reminded her she was on month-to-month status. No lease to protect her. No cushion. Just weeks, maybe days, before the threat of losing even this quiet place became real. That afternoon, Celeste walked to the clinic on Main Street. A small private practice, not fancy but honest. She had heard they needed help. When she entered, the receptionist barely looked up. Celeste offered her resume and explained she was looking for part-time work, even front desk duties if needed. The woman took the paper, skimmed the name, then paused. "You're that nurse, right? The one for the news." Celeste said nothing. The receptionist pushed the paper back. "We don't want any attention here." "Sorry." Outside, the sun was too bright. Her eyes stung. She sat on a bench and let the world move around her. For the first time in years, Celeste thought about quitting. Not just nursing. Everything. Maybe the world no longer needed people like her. Maybe kindness didn't matter anymore. Maybe prayers were better whispered in secret than offered in love. Maybe silence really was the only safe place left. That night, the lights in her apartment flickered, then went out. She had forgotten the bill. Or maybe she just hadn't opened the envelope. She lit a single candle, placed it on the windowsill, and sat beside it, holding Layla's picture in her lap. The flame wavered in the glass, her reflection barely visible behind it. A woman forgotten, a woman labeled, a woman alone. But far away, in a tall building made of glass and steel, another woman sat in an office with that same letter in her hand. Aaron's sister, a woman in uniform. A woman who had seen war zones and triage tents, who had watched men die screaming and women give birth in chaos. A woman who had risen through the ranks of military chaplaincy with steel in her spine and fire in her heart. She had flown in for her mother's funeral. She had watched Celeste from the back row, not ready to say anything. But now she was ready. The letter her brother gave her was enough. The kindness her mother spoke of in her last breath was enough. The prayer that someone had tried to punish was enough. She picked up the phone. "I need to speak with the board. I want her case reopened." Somewhere, as Celeste sat in her dark apartment, a phone began to ring. Not hers. Not yet. But it was coming. Life hadn't forgotten her. It was just waiting for the right time to remind the world who she really was. The phone rang 3 times before she picked it up. Celeste had almost let it go to voicemail, thinking it was another collection notice or a scam call. Her voice was hoarse when she answered, quiet and cautious. "Hello." A pause. Then a woman's voice, calm but firm. "Ms. Johnson, my name is Captain Aaliyah Monroe. I believe we need to talk." Celeste sat up straighter, confused. "I'm sorry, who?" "My mother was Evelyn Monroe. You were with her when she passed." Celeste's breath caught. She remembered the name now. Evelyn, the patient with the trembling hands and soft voice. The woman who had asked for prayer in the middle of the night. Celeste said, her voice barely a whisper. "Your mother, she was kind." Another pause on the line, this time heavier. "She said the same about you. Before she died, she told my brother and me that you were the only person who made her feel seen. She told us. You reminded her of her own mother." Celeste's eyes filled, but she said nothing. "I've read the letter you left," Aaliyah continued. "And I've also read the complaint that was filed against you. I want you to know something. I don't take silence lightly, but I also don't take injustice lightly. What they did to you, what they've allowed to happen, it's wrong. And I plan to make that clear." Celeste didn't know what to say. Her heart was thudding, but part of her still didn't trust it. Too many times the world had dangled hope only to snatch it away. "Why are you doing this?" she asked carefully. Aaliyah's voice didn't waver. "Because my mother asked me to, and because you shouldn't lose everything for giving someone peace in their final moments. My team is putting together a petition to have your case re-examined. I've spoken to someone on the state board. You will be contacted officially within the next few days." Celeste pressed her hand to her chest. The silence between them hummed with meaning. Before they hung up, Aaliyah added one more thing. "Ms. Johnson, you don't have to fight alone anymore." The line went dead. Celeste stared at the phone, unsure if it had all really happened. Then she stood, walked to the kitchen, and made a fresh pot of tea for the first time in a week. It tasted different, warmer, like something in her bones had remembered what hope was. 2 days later, a courier delivered a letter. This one wasn't stamped in red. It was hand-delivered, sealed in cream-colored paper with a gold emblem from the state nursing board. Inside was a formal notice. Her case was being reopened. New evidence had come to light. A character witness had come forward. In bold letters, it read, "Temporary suspension lifted pending review." The weight that left her shoulders in that moment wasn't loud or cinematic. It was quiet, slow, like ice melting after a long storm. Celeste placed the letter on her table and went to her closet. She pulled out her nurse's bag, untouched since the day she was let go. Her stethoscope was still there. So was her ID badge, the ink faded but the photo still smiling. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew she would show up. That same afternoon, Aaliyah visited the hospital in person. She wore her uniform, the one with the stripes, the honors, the medals earned in places where death came quickly and prayers came often. She walked into the administrative office like she belonged there because she did. The same woman who had fired Celeste tried to put on a professional face, but Aaliyah didn't give her time. "You fired the nurse who prayed with my dying mother. That prayer was requested. You made a decision based on perception, not fact. And now that decision is going to be reviewed. Publicly." The administrator opened her mouth, but said nothing. Aaliyah placed a folder on the desk. Inside were the letters, the testimonies, even a video from the patient's daughter, who had arrived minutes too late to say goodbye, but who had later learned that Celeste had held her mother's hand until the very end. "This folder is being sent to the press by noon, unless your office takes immediate corrective action." She stood, not waiting for a response. The air shifted after that. Fast. The hospital board scheduled an emergency session. Celeste was invited. Not required. Invited. She showed up with clean shoes and trembling hands. But her back was straight, her voice clear. She sat at the table across from the very people who had escorted her out like a criminal and answered every question with grace. No anger, no bitterness, just truth. When asked if she had any regrets, Celeste said one thing, only that I didn't hold her hand longer. The room fell silent. One by one, the members of the board looked at each other. Then the man at the center cleared his throat. "Ms. Johnson, we believe your actions came from a place of compassion, not misconduct. This board owes you an apology. Your record is being restored, effective immediately." Celeste nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't smile wide. She just exhaled. Later that week, a press release went out. It was simple. Former nurse reinstated after wrongful termination. But the story didn't end there, because one of the reporters who picked it up remembered her name. He was the same young man who once received a blanket and sandwich from Celeste after being discharged from the ER in college. He wrote a piece that night called "The Nurse Who Prayed." It went viral, but Celeste didn't know that yet. She was back in her apartment, folding clean sheets, getting ready to return to work the next day. Her phone buzzed with messages from strangers. Notes of thanks, letters of support. Someone even sent flowers. But the only message that made her pause came from a number she didn't recognize. It read, "You helped my mother find peace. Now let me help you find yours. Welcome back, Ms. Johnson. The world needs you." She closed her eyes. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled like something new. And for the first time in a long time, Celeste believed maybe, just maybe, this world still had room for quiet miracles. The morning light poured through her window like a quiet blessing. Celeste woke before her alarm, as she always had for years. Only this time, there was something different in the air. Not nerves, not dread, just stillness. A kind of peace she hadn't felt in months. Maybe longer. She stood in front of the mirror and buttoned her freshly pressed uniform, the same shade of soft blue she had worn every shift for 17 years. The name tag gleamed under the light, and for a moment she just stared at it. Not because it was new, but because it was still hers. Outside, the city moved on like it always did. Buses hissed, people rushed, car horns flared. But Celeste took her time. She walked down her building's steps slowly, savoring each one like a small victory. As she reached the sidewalk, someone called her name. She turned to see the young mother she had helped weeks ago with the groceries. This time, the woman was holding a small bouquet of daisies and a hand-drawn card from one of her toddlers. She smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you for being kind when you didn't have to." Celeste accepted the gift with a quiet nod. She didn't need applause. Moments like these were more than enough. At the hospital entrance, everything looked the same but felt different. The sliding doors opened with their familiar whoosh. Nurses hurried past, clipboards clicked, pagers buzzed. But there was a hush as she stepped through. People looked up. Some smiled. Others lowered their gaze, uncertain. And then someone clapped. Just once. And then another. And then a few more. A slow ripple of hands, soft and steady, filled the hallway. She didn't expect it. She didn't want it. But it came anyway. A small wave of gratitude. Not for headlines or pity, but for the quiet strength they had overlooked. One of the janitors, a man named Louise who'd always saved her favorite tea in the break room, stepped forward and handed her a badge. A new one. Same name. Same face. But this time, it came with an apology. "They should have never taken it from you," he said. She thanked him with a gentle smile, then turned toward the hallway where her new shift would begin. She wasn't placed in the ER again. Not yet. Instead, she was offered a role as a nurse educator, mentoring younger staff, helping train them not just in medical care, but in bedside presence, empathy, human grace. Her first day back, she spoke to a room of interns. She told them about protocols, procedures, medications, but more than that, she told them what it meant to truly care. How sometimes all a person has left is their dignity, and how easily it can be taken, and how powerfully it can be restored. Some of them took notes. Some of them just listened. All of them felt something shift. After the session, one young nurse came up and said, "I hope I become a nurse like you." Celeste didn't respond with words. She just placed her hand gently over the girls and nodded. Days passed, then weeks. Her life didn't suddenly become luxurious. She still lived in the same apartment,